Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you all for having me here, and thank you to Mike for helping to get this organized and setting this up, and thank you to my camera lady, Leah, for making the trek out to do this, and for co-conspirator, David, for also attending, so thank you so much. So, without further ado, I'll start with a little reflection on the title of the talk as advertised, which is called Trembling Hope, and sounds a little odd at first. And what it refers to is Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And the final stanza of that runs, "No farther seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God." So the poem became very famous historically through it being quoted at length by General James Wolfe, who was killed during the French and Indian War, the Battle of Quebec. It made the poem become sort of remembered in history. But for me, it always had a very meaningful element to it because of this line about trembling hope, and it refers to, when you think about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, but also this element of hope, which is so important to all of us with our virtues and our failings and everything else, that we must at the end of the day consign ourselves to, the bosom of our Father and our God. And I think for me as a storyteller, this concept, this sort of recapitulation of everything and all characters and all scenarios in Christ, kind of ties back into this. It is this trembling hope that affects everything. And I personally am something of a hopeful universalist in a Hans Urs von Balthasar model. So this inevitably impacts my writing as well. But even if one doesn't ascribe to that particular model, I think all Christians would see the importance of hope in storytelling, because it's at the crux, quite literally, of the Christian story. It's what Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, that sudden joyous turn where all that seems to have gone utterly wrong, and it seems it could never be made right, is made right. And so that is the cross and resurrection. That is why, Pope John Paul II, you said, we are the Easter people, and hallelujah is our song. So that, again, I think is something that does make Christian storytelling important and have a very important role, especially in our modern era where nihilism has become so prevalent. Nihilism and materialism, and just a general lack of meaning, and by extension a lack of hope. So that definitely impacts, again, the creative process for me. So as Mike introduced, my first novel was Saplings of Sherwood, which is the first book in a Robin Hood retelling series called The Telling of the Bees. And it dealt a lot with those aspects of hope and so forth, because Robin Hood, as a figure in folklore and mythology and history, is a figure of hope. I mean, even with a cursory knowledge, for example, of the animated Disney feature from childhood, something that stuck with me for, pretty much the time I first watched it as a kid all the way to now, is that line about, you do so much to keep our hopes alive, Robin Hood. Like, there's these elements of that sort of how heroes function within our storytelling, legends and myths and so forth. It is ultimately about hope. That it gives us hope, it gives us just encouragement, really, to go on, that we believe that people can do heroic things, which at the end of the day has to do with virtue in different levels. And my take on the Robin Hood story was with the intention of emphasizing the religious ethos of medieval England, which of course was richly Catholic. And so I did my best to kind of emphasize that, because it tends to be whitewashed out a lot in, Robin Hood retellings, and not just Robin Hood, but when you think about like King Arthur, for example, and others, there is a tendency for it to be just taken out. So I did my best to sort of put it back in, and to make that an important aspect of the world, and therefore have these themes of hope and redemption within a very Christian context affect all of the characters involved to greater or lesser extents in terms of how they are living their faith. Some live it very well, some very poorly, some in between, but all of them on some level are affected again by this idea of trembling hope. We, as the readers, are supposed to have this sense of hope for them, and they, at different points in their lives, experience that hope in their lives, sort of grace breaking in upon them. And it's the same with my secondary book, Pendragon's Shield, which is a collection of poems. So it has a lot of historical and legendary and mythological references and so forth, which always do come back again to that theme of that whatever historical moment I'm touching upon, or even whatever legendary story I'm touching upon, whatever characters are involved in this, it's important to reflect upon their humanity, and again that element of hope, because where there is humanity, there is hope, because human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So those are the two projects that I have published, and now I'll transition into talking about the project that is coming out on May 28th and is already available for pre-order digitally on Amazon. And it is a book called Gone for a Soldier, and it's the first of a trilogy called All Ye That Pass By. So the basic premise of it is that there's a young man from a Catholic recusancy family in the 18th century in northern England, and his family used to be quite well-to-do, but they've fallen on hard times, in large part because of their Catholicism. Now, this is jumping forward in history from where we left Robin Hood, where everything was densely Catholic in England, and now we're fast-forwarding centuries, and the Anglican ascendancy has essentially outlawed Catholicism. So, you have people who are clinging on to the faith, but they can't be full, parts of society, because there are various oaths and acts that they have to ascribe to, essentially apostatizing from their faith in order to be part of so many different things, ranging from going to universities to having careers in the law, in politics, in the military, voting, and things like owning any kind of weaponry, like guns or swords. Sometimes, in some cases, owning horses was forbidden. And so it ranged quite dramatically depending on the particular point during the timeline, and during who was in charge and what county was being affected and so forth. But generally speaking, it was bad. It was bad time to be a Catholic in England. And you basically, and furthermore, actually, to be even a dissenting Protestant in England, because if you were not part of the Anglican ascendancy, you were going to struggle. And there was different ways in which they tried to kind of bring some dissenting Protestants into the settlement, like in terms of the Presbyterians, for example. They tried to have it where, like if you were taking the Test Act, for example, this was to say the king is the head of the church, or the governor of the church. It varied a little from point to point, but the point is, as a Presbyterian, you don't really believe that, but they cut a deal, which was, well, interpret it as defender of sort of Protestant rights, and we're all kind of getting together against the Catholics, right? So you take that oath and you view it like that. You view that's what it means to be the governor of the church, or the head of the church. And so some Presbyterians would take that, and to this very day, I don't know if any of you watched the coronation of Charles III, but to this day, they take oaths to uphold the Protestant religion, and because Charles he's governor of the Church in England, but he's a member of the Kirk in Scotland, and this is part of the whole Act of Union settlement, one of these settlements. So, anyway, the acts were very particularly targeting Catholics, though. They would particularly talk about things like the Pope, transubstantiation, Mary and the Communion of Saints. It was very, very targeted, even though it did sweep in other denominations of Protestantism sometimes at the same time. So this story is focusing on that experience of the character whose name is Edmund, and Edmund Southworth, and he's a young man, and he really, really badly wants to just be a full-fledged member of his society. He doesn't want to be on the fringes anymore, even though he is a pretty pious Catholic, but he feels worn down by all of this, and he badly wants to join the military, because he thinks, you don the scarlet coat, if you will, you're then a full-fledged member of British society. You're accepted now, and that will finally get rid of the stain that's on him of always being accused either of being a traitor or of being a coward, and it's hard for him to deal with. So, in the course of the story, he ends up, after his father's death, meeting and befriending General John Burgoyne, who later will become famous due to the American Revolution. So, Burgoyne was from Lancashire, and Lancashire is in the north of England, and it had the highest population of Catholics at the time. So, he knew and had some sympathies, at least, for giving Catholics some rights back, to a point. Again, he still was part of the Anglican ascendancy, so it was conditional. But basically, in the storyline, he kind of takes Ned under his wing, and he sort of encourages him by little steps, if you will, to apostatize, to take the Test Act, to come into the military, and to go with him on the Saratoga campaign in 1777, which was, from his perspective, a kind of a little romp, a little adventure that you'd go on, and it was a great way to start your military career. And he thought it was going to be very easy to put an end to the rebellion in the colonies. He thought this was kind of a foolproof plan, and it would work out fine and dandy. It didn't. So Ned ultimately, and Ned is Edmund's nickname, Ned ultimately caves, and he ultimately takes the Test Act. And he goes on the march, and that's how this story becomes an American Revolution story. And so he ends up in North America, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. So bad, so bad. And so ultimately, he's just watching everything that he sort of gave up his faith for, to be a part of, crumble completely. It was said of Burgoyne's march that the disaster destroyed the flower of the English gentry. This was a situation where you had thousands of people not just dying, but being utterly humiliated, and then ending up in POW camps where thousands more died. And it was just a catastrophe, a wipeout. And so, it makes Ned have to question, well, did I do the right thing here? And was, the question of greater and lesser goods, which is an important theme in the story. That, there are lesser goods. Your love of friends, your love of family, your love of your country, your love of your locality, your, town, your village. There's lesser goods, even heroism in battle, these sort of virtues, if you will. They still pale in comparison to God, which basically ties into a line from A Man for All Seasons, which is a massive inspiration for this project. Where essentially Thomas More says to his friend the Duke of Norfolk that, God alone is love through and through. So you can love all of these things, people, places, you're sovereign. But at the end of the day, if what you're doing is setting them up on a pedestal above God, then it's all for naught. It's all going to come sort of tumbling down. So Ned, in the end of it, has to really kind of make some serious decisions and, try to right himself, if you will, with his conscience, and deal with all of the trauma that he's now kind of incurred, and sort of become, if you will, both return to what he was and become a different person, because you can never really go completely back. And he ends up fulfilling his destiny in a way that he really couldn't have done if he hadn't gone through all that. But it definitely causes him to fulfill what is his namesake, and it's the two Edmunds, which gets referenced throughout the story. And the first Edmund is Edmund the Martyr, who was an Anglo-Saxon king who was martyred by Vikings in the Dark Ages. So that's the first patron saint of England, one of the first patron saints. There's kind of three. There's Saint Alban, who was called the proto-martyr of Britain. He was killed during the Roman persecution. And then there's Saint Edmund, who was the patron saint for quite some time, is acknowledged really as the patron saint. And then ultimately it was Saint George, which came about through Richard the Lionheart's devotion to George during the Crusades. But that's the first Edmund. The second Edmund is St. Edmund Campion, who, of course, is the great member of the 40 Martyrs of England and Wales. And he was executed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth and the persecution there. So Edmund really, draws on these two origin points of his namesake, and throughout it, different instances will remind him of this, who he is, and the fact that he's marked by martyr's blood. No matter what he does, no matter how far he strays, his namesake is on him. He can't get away from it. And the meaning of the name Edmund means defender of wealth. And so it's often been remarked that St. Edmund Campion, it was an interesting play on things because he, of course, came to England disguised as a jewel merchant. If priests were outlawed, you couldn't be a priest, a Catholic priest in England, and people who were caught harboring them could also suffer all manner of penalty, including the death penalty in some cases. But it could be lesser, it could be imprisonment for life, it could be having your property confiscated, it could be having your name taken away, quite literally. I actually know people who are descendants of that situation where their names were kind of dissolved by the government. So basically you have a situation where defender of wealth, though for Edmund, becomes our Edmund in the story, becomes a commentary on what is actually the true wealth, what is actually the true riches, and what we're willing to defend, and to what extent. And this ties into another situation in British history, where after Burgoyne's fatal march, and after, this was the turning point of the American Revolution. So the disaster at Saratoga for the British, it was a disaster on so many different levels, but the sheer wipeout effect that it had back in Britain actually caused the government to be like, well, since we've literally annihilated so many of our youth, perhaps we should let the Catholics inherit in order to, balance off the deficit, really. And perhaps we should let Catholics join the military without forcing them to take all of these acts and oaths that go against their conscience. Maybe we should do that. And what ends up happening is that there's massive, massive riots break out in London. And these were culminative things because of a lot of different situations. The country was in economic freefall. You had this terrible happening with Saratoga. They're getting humiliated on a world stage due to the American Revolution. I think that's something that is important to remember about the American Revolution from the British vantage point. Losing to your own colonies is, in this time period, you're getting knocked off of, your pedestal as a world power. You're being humiliated before the other powers of Europe. and you're being ushered into a world war, because of course that's what happened. France and Spain and the Netherlands got involved on the side of the colonies for their own selfish motivations, of course. So this is something that was really, really a dent to Britain and their understanding of themselves and their understanding of the unity of the empire and all of the rest of it. And I think it's interesting as well to even reflect on General Burgoyne's way of coming in on this war and his point of view. Because when he would write, he was a playwright on the side and a poet, so he was a very flowery guy in a lot of ways, and he would almost frame it like he was a knight. He was a knight errant, and he was going on this sort of quest for his king to restore him to his rightful position over his dominions, and to rescue the loyalists who he felt were being persecuted by this new revolutionary government. So it was something that he, really viewed in kind of this idealistic, romantic light. And then when everything goes the way that it does, it is in large part due to his fatal ambition. And so it becomes almost like a Shakespearean tragedy, what happens to him and to everyone who was involved. It becomes like so many, again, fables back in the day of one thing or another. A person goes out with good intentions to do something amazing, and then their flaws get in the way, and they end up sinking the whole ship. And that's very much what happened with Burgoyne. And it's a tragedy, though, that I think commonly when we deal with people like Burgoyne or other sort of British figures in the American Revolution, we tend to do this thing where we put them apart, and we view, if there's like a moral to be taken from it, maybe we do kind of give the moral pride comes before the fall, but I notice we don't identify with the people falling, and perhaps that's really what we should do, because that's more instructive, because what it does is it teaches us, oh yeah, I can easily do that, super easily. We all have a little bit of Burgoyne in us in terms of wanting to do something really amazing, and then ourselves get in the way. And it's very, very easy to do that. And so the story and the trilogy in general kind of is meant to be a commentary on this. It's meant to be the Saratoga campaign and the wider revolution as seen from the side that loses, in order to appreciate the fact that, we could easily have been there on that side in that situation and would have been learning the same hard lesson, and the lessons that these characters are learning as they're going through hell, really, and they are facing the potential of death, but also of complete humiliation. They have to, whether it's Edmund or any of the other characters, face this question, hey, where do I stand with higher things, What happens to me, if at the end of this I don't come back and, all fanfare and everything like that? What if I don't come back at all? What if I'm buried in a shallow grave and dug up by wolves? What happens here? And so it becomes a meditation on the four last things when it comes in stark relief like this to the situation. And that, I think matters in terms of us reflecting on history, and that's why the whole trilogy is called All Ye That Passed By, and of course it's from the biblical verse, all ye that passed by, attend and see if there's any sorrow like unto my sorrow. And it's supposed to be sort of double meaning. The one is that it's talking about the Catholic situation and what Catholics endured during this period in Britain and the colonies. But it's also talking about the experience of war that all of these characters have been through, and the experience of defeat. And so that, it basically becomes this sharp light cast upon suffering, sorrow, and where is the redemption in this? And so that, generally speaking, is the overview. I'm just looking to see if on my notes if I skipped anything. Oh yes, just lastly with the Gordon riots. Yes, so the Gordon riots are kind of a bit unknown or lacking in, knowledge in terms of what we talk about. But they were quite terrible. Like nearly 300 people, were killed or like horribly injured in these things. And they were some of the worst anti-Catholic riots to date, and they took place in London over the course of multiple days. And it's interesting, again, how when we think of, for example, like the draft riots in New York during the American Civil War, well, the amount of deaths is much, much lower, and yet somehow that sticks in the mind more, I would say, than the Gordon riots, and not as well known, even in Britain. So it's interesting, and I was really kind of impassioned to try to shine a light on that, and to show, I think, something where the focus is more on the 18th century, because the thing is that, we think a lot about the persecutions in the 16th century. That's like the big era of the martyr-making kind of situation going on in the British Isles. However, it's not something that just went away. It continued. You continued having actual bloody martyrdoms into the 17th century, to the late 17th century. And then even though things loosened up a bit in the 18th century, so you didn't have the disavoweling priests. Now it was just life imprisonment. Okay. So so you had that kind of thing. You still had all the confiscations. You still had all of the impediments to them being a full part of society. And you still had these awful Gordon riots, where anti-Catholicism was very, very, very baked into things and very strong. So, and quite, again, amazingly given how Catholic the country originally was, it's almost like there was kind of a mind wipe that occurred, where people saw it as foreign, completely as a foreign thing. And there was some political reasons for this, obviously. There was the ongoing cycle of violence between Catholics and Protestants that just went on cycle in various parts of Europe. So people had trauma both ways and reacted accordingly, and the cycle continued. There was a lot of different issues in terms of the different powers of Europe fighting for control of different things. And so it all played in, but I was eager again to tell this particular story in this particular setting because of how it tends to be underrated, especially because we know, like, as Americans about the American Revolution, we don't really know about what was going on with Catholics at the time in Britain and in the colonies, and so that was just something that I wanted to really reflect on as, kind of a long-term Anglophile American. I wanted to reflect on those two things. So it was important to me to do that. So I will now transition into reading an excerpt of the trilogy, which deals with, and I'll give a little bit of background to what this is, because this excerpt actually comes from the third book. I write chronically out of order, so it's definitely kind of all over the place a little bit. But this particular excerpt deals with Major John Andre. I don't know if any of you guys have watched Turn. We're going to say that's a reference point that you know who he is. I thought they messed him up terribly, but at the same time, he's an interesting, very interesting character out of history who basically, a British military officer and intelligence officer during the American Revolution, came from a Huguenot background. So these are French Calvinists who had to leave themselves France due to religious persecution, ended up in various parts of other parts of Europe that would take them, including Britain, and including the colonies. So he has that background. He was born and raised in Britain, though. And he is a very colorful character. Leah and I have a running thing where I've tormented Leo. I've tormented her with Major Sparkles, because he's sparkly, and there's nothing we can do about it, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he's a very colorful character, a very interesting character, and but he ends up getting hanged. He ends up getting hanged because he was embroiled in the Benedict Arnold affair, the situation where Arnold was basically going to defect over to the British side for mainly cash and a chance to advance because he didn't feel like he was being treated right. And he was like this the whole time. There was not, honestly, a point at which Benedict Arnold... I don't like the takes where they're kind of like, oh, Benedict, he was a great guy until Peggy, his wife, got to him, and then he suddenly transmuted. No, if you read his stuff, he was always a pretty self-serving character, and it seems very much like he utilized the American Revolution as a means to climb, and once he realized that wasn't doing it for him, he jogged over the other side. And so that was that. So, you have a situation where Andre is sent by the British in order to liaison with him, to be essentially an ambassador to him, to be a go-between. And then he's supposed to go back to his ship, take the plans that Arnold gives him, the ones that this was the deal. How you give the plans to West Point, and you go back to the ship. Things go very wrong. Andre can't get back to his ship. Arnold tells him, hey, dude, I don't want to get caught, so you're going to have to just go behind enemy lines. Like, that's kind of a dumb idea. It's okay. You can just change out of your uniform. That's also a really dumb idea. It's like, no, you have to do this. And so he ultimately changes out of his uniform. A very dumb idea. So he gets captured like this. So on a technicality of you've changed out of your uniform, he can be hanged as a spy, even though Andre was not actually on a spying mission per se. He was on an ambassadorial mission, a go-between man. But essentially, he got kangaroo courted, is the best way of putting it. And, they said it's better that essentially one man die on behalf of the nation. It'd be good for the nation to set an example. That was basically what the tribunal decided. And so he was hanged. And the interesting part of this story, the part that is, most fascinating, in addition to the fact that he ran basically early Renaissance fairs, that's another issue, is that he was very colorful, is that he had a sort of return to faith before his execution. And he wrote down before he died a hymn that he had memorized, and he folded it in his pocket, and it was found on his body after he was taken down from the gallows. And so it speaks, the first line is, Hail sovereign love that first began this scheme to rescue fallen man, hail matchless free eternal grace that gave my soul a hiding place. So this scene that I'm going to read here essentially deals with Andre and Ned, the main character. At first, he thinks Ned is a spy because that's his job. He's supposed to root out spies from the British service. And Ned has been outed as a Catholic earlier, but this hasn't all come out. It's all complicated. I won't give you all the details on that. Suffice to say, Andre figures out he's a Catholic, and there's tension here because he was Calvinist. Catholics and Calvinists persecute each other and everything like that. But he eventually says, hey, you know what? Are we going to continue this cycle of violence, or am I going to give this guy a break and help him get home without getting arrested, essentially? And that's where we open this, after they have a little scene together where there's just kind of a downtime scene. I'm not gonna, and so then they're talking over books, and because he's living in Ben Franklin's house. Sorry about that. He's quartered in Benjamin Franklin's house, and Andre has decided this is like a book sale, except way cooler. I don't have to pay for anything. So he's essentially taking books. So he's giving Ned a book. I saved something special for you, Andre said, picking up a book with a gold-embossed binding. The writings of Francois Fenelon. I am afraid Roman Catholic archbishops from France are not quite to my usual taste, given my Huguenot heritage, but he once wrote, all wars are civil wars because all men are brothers. I find that rings true to me. Royalists and revolutionaries, papists and Protestants, you and me. It's all the same tragedy, with fear and hate and revenge running on, seemingly without end, claiming more victims by the day. But we can endeavor, in our own small ways, to disrupt that pattern. You seem the sort to do it, Captain, Ned remarked. Sometimes, yes, I try. He gestured broadly. I remember one day seeing our soldiers herding a couple of rebels onto one of the prison hulks, where so many of their comrades lie rotting. These two were mere boys, 14 or 15 at most. One even started to weep and could not be moved. I was struck, suddenly, oh so suddenly, by the thought, not quite my own, that they were, as Fenelon said, my brothers, and my heart bled for them, as it might bleed for my own blood. A bitter grace that, in such a bitter war as this. So I found myself going over to the boy who was weeping, and I talked with him, and he told me how he had been happy with his family that very morning, and now he and his brother would never see them again. Andre bit his lip. I told him not to cry, but rather to show himself manly. Then I ordered the soldiers not to touch either of them till my return. I went off and pulled what strings I could with the general. I managed to do that, ever and anon, you know. Beg poor devils off according to his good pleasure. So I went back, and the guards were saying, the fool lads should thank their lucky stars that I had seen them. And I felt a dreadful weight at the prospect of so many like them I had not seen. I told them I had good news for them, that they were put under my authority to do with as I pleased, and that I would be pleased if they ran away. Andre chuckled, then grew solemn. I told them to go home and to fear God. I told them to be good boys and honor their parents and keep all the commandments, and that if they did so, the Lord would bless them. I told them, he winced. I told them not to be like me. Ned touched his arm. I think if the world had a few more people like you in it, it would not be worse for wear. Well, let's just say I hope those two young scoundrels end up with 12 children apiece. And then they each have 12 children apiece, and on down their lineage, so that when this rebellion is subdued and the king's peace restored, it can be said that I helped repopulate British America. He smiled, his wonderfully warm smile, as he handed the book to Ned. I figured you might find it suitable reading on the voyage home. The word home made Ned's heart leap in his chest. Captain, if I am indeed going home, shall it be as a free man or under arrest? Don't fret, Andre said kindly. I've had a good long conversation with General Howe, and, well, he agrees with me that you pose no imminent threat. It is my job to ascertain these things, and I'd like to believe I am thorough about it. All you need do is quietly resign from the service upon your return to England, and no further inquiries will be made, at least, not unless you give us a future cause. I do hope you respect me enough not to prove my judgment ill-founded. Ned swallowed hard. I would rather have my hand struck off than ever raise it against my countrymen. Andre nodded. I have chosen to believe that and put my name to it. Speaking of which, call me John or John. My family's preference, I answer to both. Ned smiled. Thank you. They walked back into the room where various crafts for the party remained incomplete. It felt somehow melancholic to Ned, a moment of life so full of laughter, now consigned to silence. He thought back on so many of his friends, consigned to silence as well, and found himself worrying for Andre. Oh, Ned, Andre exclaimed, glancing down at the table where Edmund had been set to work, making paper chains. What's this? He picked up a cross braided from the leftover scraps of colored paper. When I was young, I used to make them out in the tall grass behind our house during Eastertide, Ned explained. I know it's Christmastide now, but nothing, Andre dismissed. It's gorgeous. He held it out in front of his face, studying it for a long while, and his eyes became hazy. Then he murmured, Late have I loved thee. He turned back to Ned and must have seen the surprise on his face, for he repeated, Late have I loved thee, beauty so ancient and so new. For behold, thou were within me, and I outside. And I sought thee outside, and in my unloveliness fell upon those lovely things that thou hast made. Thou were with me, and I was not with thee. I was kept from thee by those things, yet had they not been in thee, they would not have been at all. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, sadly. Yes, I've studied Augustine, just as Calvin did. Geneva, remember? Besides, I have a cracking good memory for such things. To this day, I find myself memorizing a hymn or two, if it makes me feel something, beyond the monotony and frivolity that fill my days. He turned his eyes back to the cross. Augustine also said, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. Yes, Lord, make me holy, but not yet. Lord, make me thine, but not yet. His voice drifted off. You know the part they never talk about? How much the man who says not yet suffers. How much he starves himself. Yes, he is to be pitied, that man. His eyes grew glassy now, like pools of water so deep the bottom could not be seen. He touched me, Ned, early and late, and how I have you burned to see his face and know his peace. But the world is full of distractions. My hope is that his sovereign love may yet hatch some scheme to arrest me and give my soul a hiding place. Then I shall have him, and in him everything else as he was meant to be had. It would be the greatest romance, adventure, and achievement. St. George, Edmund blurted. What? He was a martyr, you know. Yes, of course. That's why I made the cross. The Christmas play you've been preparing reminded me of him and his passion in Christ's imitation. Yes, it's like the cross of St. George, Andre connected. Our flag, yes. Blood red for our patron saint, yes. And a soldier, yes, John. Patron of soldiers too. And our coats match the flag, and his blood matches Christ's blood. So you see, Ned let out a shaky sigh. Perhaps we would do well to emulate him beyond the play. Perhaps we should learn to love what he loved and how he loved. Pray to him, don't you mean? Andre snorted. I know how you papists think. I think he will intercede for us regardless, for he has not forsworn England. Ned looked at Andre earnestly. He will always point us back to the cross, for we cannot escape it, just as he could not escape it. Andre turned back to the cross himself. After several moments of silence, he said thickly, I do not wish to escape it. Then unexpectedly, Andre brought the crisscross strips of paper to his lips, quickly but passionately, then blushed bright red, gently set it back upon the table, and fled the room. And Edmund realized in his heart that he did not wish to escape it either.
So we're going to open it up to Q&A now, but before we do that, I just have to remind you that the session is being recorded. So if you ask a question verbally, that is consent to being recorded. So any questions?
We want consent. We do.
We don't want to violate the
We don't
Wiretap
want to do
Act.
that.
So is it being recorded?
Yeah.
Why do you choose, for your writings, why do you choose to do like historical settings as opposed to say something in the present or in the future? You know, why is it that you choose the eras you do for your writings?
I've always had a deep interest in history. I think it's just something that I've always grown up with. I don't think there's like a particular moment at which I can conceive of it beginning. But I will say that past time periods in many ways had a very rich sense of culture, which I feel like sadly we're lacking now. There was a rich sense of religion as well, which I feel like we have lost in our societies. So you can deal with religious themes much more directly, whether it has to do with the Middle Ages, which was of course a very densely religious age, or the 18th century, which straddles a bit more because you're going toward the Enlightenment and deism and everything else. Kind of like I mentioned in the beginning of the talk about Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard and General Wolfe quoting it. One of the things that makes that impactful to me is that Wolfe, based on his letters, was very much of a deist. He believed in God. He never questioned the belief in God, but it wasn't really a personal God. He felt like he couldn't pray. So that's why the fact that he was quoting this very religious poem speaking of God as a father, I always found very moving, like leading up right to his death. So you have that in the 18th century, that situation. But still, there's enough religion there, even as it was starting to lean toward this more watered down situation, where you're leaning towards the Enlightenment, and then that eventually sets us all on the path for secularism, if you will. There still was a lot of very vigorous religious tradition. Whether that was Catholic or different brands of Protestantism, Christianity was still really a force to be reckoned with in a very public way. It permeated everything to a certain extent. So that's important for me, to be able to explore those elements in an environment which feels more organic to it, I'm afraid, than our own.
You made reference in your talk about how you yourself have been a long time Anglophile.
Indeed.
and I know from my conversation with you, you are still a very avowed and Anglophile, and you love everything to do with England. But I also know that you're also someone who's a devout Catholic. And so obviously I know you've been talking about it only in the sense of separating yourself from it, focusing solely on this historicity of everything. But I guess as someone like yourself who is a self-identified Anglophile, and knowing the history of how England, not just within the homeland, but also even abroad in many of its colonies, has persecuted the mother church, like how, I guess in a way, how would you say you kind of reconcile that in your mind with the long history to do with that, yet simultaneously, keep you to the faith, if you get where I'm coming from?
Well, it kind of comes down to the story of Edmund that just commenting on, is that I guess in a sense, you have in that story that whole question of Edmund as a character is trying to reconcile his love of his country, his love of his roots, which were of course Catholic, because England was very Catholic. England was Our Lady's dowry, and where it's now gone, of course, there's a schism which you can feel very vividly in England. I was just there again in October, and it does, for a Catholic, it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see all of these Catholic churches, Catholic buildings that, have been taken away. And now things have even gotten worse because, back in the day, Anglicans used to be a bit more based. Now it's really gone down the tubes. We happened to be in Ely Cathedral when they were having a concert of sort of fake Fleetwood Mac. And it's just like, what universe are you guys in that you thought this was appropriate? But this whole rave and the knave culture in Britain, it's manifesting where it's at right now, is that Britain has largely lost her faith. She's less than half of her people are identifying as Catholic, at least in England and Wales. I don't think it's much better in Scotland or Northern Ireland. But the point is that that's pretty dramatic. From a country that, some generations ago, everybody almost would have identified, again, even like the deists, they would have said they're Anglican, because it's just sort of a default, this is how to be Christian as an Englishman. That's how Anglicanism sort of took off and caught on. It was a state settlement. So I guess, to answer your question, it's a matter of seeing the good in a situation and in a people and in a culture, even when things are really bad, whether that is in the case of just the Anglican split, which is heartbreaking for a Catholic, or whether it's the case of just now, even worse, I would say Britain has betrayed not only her Christian roots, but by extension even herself. She's become greatly self-hating and almost pushing away her own country and history. And so that is something that I palpably, again, felt at different points in England, to the point of being depressed because of how bad it had gotten. So, yeah, but does that mean I won't love all of the good till my dying day? No, it doesn't. It means I absolutely will. And that's sort of where Edmund comes out in the end of it as well. That's his decision, that you put the greater good, but then the lesser goods fall underneath. And so that's sort of, it's about putting things in perspective. It's Thomas More, kind of, I died the king's good servant, but God's first, and all the rest of it. So it's all about getting your priorities in order.
What age group are your books targeted toward, or what age group would be appropriate for?
So I would personally say either 15 or 16 plus, so mid-teens and up. So, basically this is historical fiction that does deal with some gritty realities. It's not like super gratuitous or anything, but it is there. So, to be aware it's not really suitable for young children. But, I would probably say 15 plus. See, on Amazon they don't actually allow you to put 15 plus, bizarrely, which I don't know why. It seems like that's the more intuitive thing. It's like 15 is the middle. They make you do 16 plus. But, I would say 15 plus is fine, to be honest. Yeah, it's one of those things where I try really hard in my writings, even when I'm dealing with really dark themes, or just more mature themes, whatever they may be, to include it in a way that's tasteful. It's very important to me. I really dislike shock factor for no reason, which is so common in today's pop culture. It's just Game of Thrones, and that's something that I really, really wanted to put a lid on and be tasteful even when dealing with harsh realities of life in the day and life in our own day, but in a way that doesn't become essentially dehumanizing, because this is what I feel like about the way these programs or books handle this kind of thing. It ends up being you're treating a tragedy or you're treating whatever as something voyeuristic, So it's not about actually generating compassion for what these people are going through or something. I'm thinking of, for example, the use of murder and rape. Again, Game of Thrones, big proponent of that. And how at the end of the day, it's not about feeling compassion for murder or rape victims. It's about, oh, shocking, wow. How much further can we possibly go? And then it just gets further and further and it gets crazier and crazier. So that's something that, again, is always important for me to be able to bridge the gap, because then there's the other side of it where I feel like some Christian writers kind of go the other extreme where they're unwilling to deal with the grittier side of life or history or whatever, and then I'm like, well, no, you need to be able to deal with it because we need to be able to have Christian commentary on this. We have to be able to do that. We have to be able to weigh in. But we need to be able to do so without dehumanizing the characters we're portraying and without essentially, I don't know, just sort of sullying ourselves in the process of doing the writing, or the reading for that matter.
You talked a little bit about King Arthur and then the Robin Hood part as well, and then kind of building off of Tyler's question. Do you think there's a little bit of almost a historical schizophrenia in a way when it comes to either the fictional or real stories of England, and then they want some of that heritage, but they like to sanitize the connection. I mean, it's true of other European countries, yes, but England's probably one of the most
most obvious.
And I also think it's kind of just one of my own commentaries on it, but and I know there's more to the reason of why the Anglican picture became a thing, but do you think it's also a little bit funny that it's oh, your church really only exists because the king went to the Pope and he's like, I'm not going to divorce you, dude. And he's like, you know what, I'm going to make my own church. I just think that's kind of
funny. Well, absolutely. I agree with everything you've said. It is a schizophrenia. And this is something that when you do research on the 18th century, British understanding of self, because it was this age when Britain as a unified entity was just coming into being, really, with the union of Scotland and England, for example, so the whole island got united. So they were trying to, come up with ways to express themselves. And what would they do? Well, they turn back on their history. And what's there? Catholic stuff. And so it was this weird thing that kept happening where, for example, does anyone know where Rule Britannia came from, that song? A little trivia fact. Okay, it came from a production called The Mask of Alfred, as in Alfred the Great, as in the Catholic king, Alfred the Great. So Rule Britannia is all about him being the father of the English Navy, and he's a Catholic. But you have this Rule Britannia catching on as kind of a pseudo national anthem, if you will, and it's about a figure in history who's Catholic. When you think about General Burgoyne is a good example of jumping in on this sort of historical romanticism of the past. In terms of, he was a Richard the Lionheart fan, he translated and adapted some of the romances out of French that dealt with Richard the Lionheart. He's identifying with all of this stuff. Well, it's Richard the Lionheart, he's Catholic. So there really is a sense of this weird schizophrenia going on in terms of English and wider British history, that at a certain point, well, everybody was Catholic, everything was Catholic. It's what Edmund Campion said, basically, where it was you're betraying your own ancestors, all that was once the glory of England. What are you doing? And it's in condemning us, you're condemning yourselves, you're condemning everything you once were. So it's this great tragedy. Maybe that's part of why I'm compelled by it, is the tragic element of that, and it remains very, very visible. And the wounds remain quite open in Britain among the Catholic community. So it's very interesting. And very sad. But yeah, no, definitely with things like, as you say, King Arthur, Robin Hood, they're densely Catholic stories. if you delve into them. I mean, Robin Hood, the name of my Robin Hood series is The Telling of the Beads for a reason. That in the earliest ballads about Robin Hood, he's depicted as having this devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and praying his rosary. So, there's the nursery rhyme, Robin Hood telling his beads, all in the green wood among the green reeds. And so it's this, it's basically taking something that was so densely woven into what it meant to be English, what it meant to be, any part of the British Isles, and then just sort of unscrewing it. And what you said about, the origin point is just completely ridiculous in terms of the split. Now, obviously, as you say, there was other political things going on, and religious things going on in terms of what was going on in the continent. But yeah, essentially, you have a situation where the king does his schism for the reason of wanting to switch wives and for wanting to get an heir. And then ironically in the end, of course, his son Edward ends up dying quite young, at like 16, and then his two daughters succeed. So all of that to get a male heir, and it's pretty ridiculous in the end of it. But in the end, the reason why I would say the Anglican Church really took off under Elizabeth was political. It was very basely political. I don't think that Elizabeth, quite frankly, had much of a religious stake in it one way or the other. I think that she mainly was just trying to figure out, how can I consolidate power best? And to her, that meant, hey, this thing my dad did, actually, it's a good idea, why not? And then we'll create this sort of sense of nationhood built on sort of taking the island instinct and taking it to its extreme, and saying, hey, we're an island. We don't have to do the continent, Rome, and all of that. It's foreign. And so they really hammered it home. But at the end of the day, it's ridiculous, because England was Catholic for as long as they were Christian. And so that's an issue, massive issue. And it's something that pops up in the story with Ned a lot. What pops up is the issue that he's making friends with people who are Anglican, but they're almost gaslighting him, not intentionally, not to be bad, they actually mean well, but they're gaslighted into believing that Catholicism is foreign and a danger and everything else. And it's just weird, and it occurs to him that these people, just a few generations back, would be Catholic. So yeah. You're welcome.
Sorry, I know. I know. This is just such an interesting concept.
You set him off, and now you're back.
Yes. I'll say this one last question, and then I'll stop hogging the question time. But I guess to kind of tie up this whole conversation, this topic in particular, in a bow, would be based on as to put it, as the story of the entire Anglican denomination, and basically by default, and also the Episcopal denomination here in the United States.
Which is even worse, because that doesn't even have a king. Like, it's just stupid. That's just stupid.
Yeah, why are you American and Anglican?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at that point. I'm just like, why?
But with that being said, I guess it kind of tie it all up in a bow is, again, as someone who is much more of an Anglophile, and like I said, obviously we've covered some of the great kings. I wasn't in the room when you and during your entire talk. But I know one of the other great, my personal favorite English king would be none other than Saint Edward the Confessor,
yes.
the last Anglo-Saxon king before William the Conqueror.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously you also cover Alfred the Great.
Mm-hmm.
There are a plethora of other Catholic Anglo kings, both pre and post 1066. But I guess that really pivotal figure of Henry VIII, like he was the man that basically broke England from Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this may sound really, really harsh, but for such a piggish reason, as if, so you just want a son so badly that you will make your entire people apostates.
I can understand I'll put it this way, I can understand the concern of the having an heir was a big deal because of the War of the Roses, which had just been waging these massive dynastic conflicts, and everyone was very afraid of that happening again if they didn't have a steady succession. But of course, that's no reason to do what he did. None.
Well,
It's
I'm
like
just saying,
not a
as
good
you,
reason.
and as you pointed out too, is despite all the effort they did, it
Yeah.
ended up all failing in the end anyway. So it was ultimately
It was all futile, and really, I think that at that point, it just comes down to, like, you know, people say smash the patriarchy. I'm sort of like, well, listen, guys, that actually, if you want a real story, sometimes they say that for very stupid reasons, but for this one, it does make sense. I'm just like, you couldn't just have thought to maybe raise your daughter to be prepared to inherit. I mean, come on, you couldn't have managed to do that? Like, come on, dude.
So I guess, yeah, sorry I've been kind of meandering, but I guess the real solid question is, how do you then, based on all this historical context, how do you view Henry VIII then, as a whole?
I don't know if I should answer I will revert to Trembling Hope. I think we need to have Trembling Hope for everyone, including Henry VIII. You know, so I'll leave on a high note on that. We should pray for him.
Let's have one more
There's a question over here.
Question. Okay.
So, kind of two things. One, to build off some of that discussion, I believe with Charles, with the recent coronation of Charles, they actually changed it to Defender of the Faiths, which is one of these.
Did they actually go through with that?
I believe they did.
I know that they discussed it. I wasn't sure if they actually went through with it in terms of Defender of Faiths.
Did, which is one of those very strange, not one iota kind of.
Well,
changes.
you know, it's one of those weird things at this point because, you see, things are so broken down in Britain at this point. Like, I mean, there's like a series of breakdowns. It's like the first breakdown was just kind of the schism.
Yeah.
But then it's from there, it's because, I mean, I was basically talking to a lady just the other day about this, who's Anglican, and I was saying, because she was talking about how, like, Muslims are becoming more dominant as a religious force, and I had said, oh, more power to them if they're actually practicing. You know what? Because, I mean, the reality is Anglicans aren't doing it. By and large, they've dropped the ball. And quite frankly, I mean, Muslims are doing worlds better in showing up and doing their faith, which is not happening among a lot of Anglicans. Catholics are actually doing fairly well, interestingly enough, in terms of attendance and in terms of participation. But, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, they're small, they're tiny.
Right.
So basically, it does come down to a situation, though, where Britain, I think that whether you're practicing Anglican, Catholic, Muslim, you name it, at the moment, we do actually have a common, you know, opposition force, and that is materialism, nihilism, and complete secularism. So that seems to be the dominant thing at the moment. So in a way, even though I get why it's annoying. Well, of course, it's weird. You know, the Defender of the Faith, of course, was a term given to Henry VIII when he was in line with the Holy See, and he was writing his defense of the Seven Sacraments. That's how he got the title, before everything went very to hell in a handbasket. And so, you know, I find it interesting with Henry VIII how, like, literally Catholics and Protestants with any sense among us don't want to really own this guy. We're kind of like, we don't want him on our side, but he kind of gloms onto all of us at different points, and we're just like, please, like, wash us, purge us from this. The Anglicans, of course, have it the worst with that, but yeah, so suffice to say, I understand why Charles, if he did go through with the Defender of Faiths, did it if that's the case, because at the moment you're in a situation where it's in free fall, but it is unfortunate, of course, that the title itself got kind of screwed up. It reminds me of actually the king in the story that I'm working with, King George III, because he, of course. It was interesting. He was one of the very, meaningful Anglicans. He was devout. He was actually a good Christian, which wasn't always the case among a lot of the heads of the church, governors of church, kings and queens. But he was, and he took it very to heart. But interestingly enough, of course, he identified as Defender of the Faith to mean the Anglican Church.
But that's not, and so much so that he's opposed to Catholic emancipation movements. He was open to some early, like, let them in the army a bit, but not later ones where he let them into Parliament. He didn't want that because he believed that was a violation of his coronation oath. The weird part about this is that, of course, the coronation oath originally, like, literally, it's just a flipping Catholic thing. and then the coronation oath, I mean, it's like when they say, oh, according to Magna Carta, it's like, you gotta be kidding me, you guys, it's Catholic. And so there was just a breakdown of everything, and then everybody just wiped it all away, and it became like, oh, actually, this is talking about Anglicanism. It definitely is doing that. And it's like, under what universe is this talking about Anglicanism in any historically verifiable sense? But such being the case, the defender of the faith title got kind of warped anyway. So I'm almost kind of like, yeah, if he changes it, I don't care that much. I wish him well. He has a hard job, really, especially in terms of trying to hold any sense of British identity and religion at all together. So, I like him a lot, actually, in terms of, watching how he's had to pick up from his mother, who you can't really compare to. She's been, there for so long, hard to not. But, he's bringing himself to the job as best he can. He's making it his. And he has a traditionalist streak, which I think a lot of people don't know. People think of him as a liberal streak, progressive streak, but he has a traditional streak as well. He'll talk about different things in regards to tradition. And so I hope he does prove to be the defender of faiths in the sense of religion in the country, in whatever form it has to take to be seen, quite frankly, because that is the battle right now. I feel like that's the main focal point.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations as far as history books?
History.
Books to read that way, just to
like mine, or
no, sure. But, like, what do you use as sources? Because this is particularly something like.
I feel like I would need to get like an entire source catalog to do this properly.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Maybe give me your email and I'll probably send one because I have a Goodreads list that goes on forever, and I have like. It's been stuff I've been researching in so many different ways, whether it's books or documentaries or online, theses for a really long time.
I like reading.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing. Then you can, like I said, look out on May 28th. My first book of this trilogy is coming out, and in the meantime, Saplings of Sherwood and Pendragon Shield exist. So if you love to read, reading is there for you. So.
All right. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.